For many of you who are hearing this, you will ask why? Because actually Gandhi never spoke of the city. And that's one of the things that if you read Gandhi, you will see how much he spoke about the village life and the village economy. And he had a clear vision of what he believed the village economy should be. And I think that is extremely relevant today. But Gandhi, in fact, never really spoke about his dream and vision of urban India. And I think that is why it's important for us to draw upon what he did not say, but what he believed in, to think about what then is the vision of Gandhi in today's urban industrial India. I mean, if you think about it, and I know I'm going to paraphrase this quote of Gandhi, and I know that I know the exact phrase, but I prefer my own wording of it. Many of you would have read this conversation that Gandhi had at Hind Swaraj, where he asked himself these questions. And one of the questions he asked was, what would he like the vision of India to be, modern India to be? And would he like it to be like Britain? And he said no. And then he asked himself, but why not? After all, Britain has everything. It has the railways, it has, it has everything. Why would you not want India to be like Britain? And Gandhi said, I think something which we have to think about today in the deepest of ways. I mean, things that he said so important and so relevant. He said, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, that if it took the rape of half the world for Britain to be what it is, how many worlds would India need? And that really is the crisis today. The needs of very few people in the world have brought us to the point today where we are looking at a climate catastrophe, where we have exceeded the planetary boundaries as we know it, where our cities today have become completely unlivable. We have the vision of making every city to look like Shanghai, to look like New York, to look like London. And that is at the core of the problem. We have never really considered what is our vision of the city. What would be that vision that Gandhi would have laid out for an Indian city? And this modern city of India, therefore, desperately needs Gandhi's wisdom. We are lost in our garbage and the spit of our cars. Our air is toxic. And let's be clear, this is a countrywide phenomena. This is not just about Delhi. Chennai is equally polluted. You just have the sea to clean it up. But the fact is that we have created conditions in which our cities today are drowning in garbage, in pollution. They don't have access to housing for all. Vast numbers of people live in absolute destitution, and the same people who provide us the labor and the work that our cities desperately need. And I think this is really where we have to start confronting that model of urbanization, which is both resource and capital intensive, which uses vast amounts of resources, land, water, forest. It discharges massive amounts of waste. It is expensive, and so it can be afforded by some and not by the rest. So in some senses, the model of urbanization, which we have inherited from the rest of the world, which came post the colonial period, which came post the industrial revolution period in the Western world, that same industrial revolution which is at the core of the climate crisis that we have, that same model of urbanization is what we are adopting. And that model of urbanization uses a lot of resources. It uses land, water, forests, as I said. And therefore it is not sustainable. But because it is expensive, it is also inequitable. It is a model that we cannot work around. And that's something that we have to start recognizing as we move ahead. Let me give you two examples, two things that I work on. And and issues on which I spend most of my life thinking, working, pushing. Take the issue of air pollution. I mean, today, most of our cities, as I said, have air that is not breathable. We have lost our right to clean air, the right to breathe, which is on today's Republic Day, it has to be the most important fundamental right that we cannot afford to lose. Yet, if you look at the issue of air pollution, you have to also look at it from the point of view of equity and inequity. We have built our cities today in a manner in which minuscule numbers of people in our cities actually drive cars. The data will show you, and this is now fairly robust data that has been put together by the government's, by the Ministry of Urban Development in the Union Ministry, that most of our cities, less than 10% of the people drive a four-wheeler. But cars occupy 90% of the road space. 26% of Delhi is under roads today and flyover. So in Delhi, in my city of Delhi, which cannot breathe, less than 10% of the people, including people like me, drive cars. Our cars occupy the bulk of the road space. Our road space occupies the bulk of the land use in our cities. And in this scenario, what then happens to the 90%, 80% of the people who still need the right to drive? And this inequity in our cities is really at the bottom of air pollution. The fact is that we have created conditions in which the minuscule number of people both take up the road space as well as the airshed. And we have not got space for the remaining to be able to join this, there is no space left for them. And in all this, we have taken away the right to walk. We have taken away the right to cross a road safely. And if you look at the solutions for redesigning our cities, the opportunity then is really to think about that mass transport options, which if I was to paraphrase Gandhi once again to say that what you're looking at therefore is to say, how do I create a city which is accessible to all, which is available for all, and yet is modern and convenient enough for the rich and affordable for the poor? And that's really the big question in front of us when you come to air pollution, because there is no doubt that we have very vast numbers of very poor people in our city who cannot even take a bus today because it is too expensive. They take a cycle or they walk to work not because it is the done thing to do, and they do it because they are environmentalists. They do it because they have no options. And they are the people who provide the opportunity for us to think about how can you actually get them to have a more convenient, more affordable transport system. But how do you make sure that the rich who take the car, who would not give up their car for anything, actually also take that public transport system, because it is modern, it is convenient, and you have redesigned your city in a way that you make sure that the rich and the poor have both got access to the same system. That will also make sure that the public transport system actually works for all. Today, we design our public systems so that they are designed for the poor. But if we design them for the rich and the poor, then you will actually create systems which are far more modern, convenient, available to everyone. And this is really where the economic growth of our city will also be. But this is also the big opportunity for us to fix the issue of air pollution. It's the same thing when it comes to river pollution. I mean, today our rivers are dead. We are a generation of lost rivers. If you take Delhi, we have something called the Sahibi River, which used to be a river. Today it's called the Najafgarh drain because it is so polluted that you cannot call that a freshwater river. And yet, less than 2 generations ago, it was a freshwater river that um, came from the Aravallis and came into the Yamuna. You have the same thing in Mumbai, the Mithi Nala, the Buddha Nala in Ludhiana. And if I may say so, most of you are based in Chennai. I mean, you have Buckingham Canal, which is today nothing more than just a canal full of excreta. And yet these are, whether it is the Coombe or Adyar or Buckingham, these were intricate systems of being able to manage the water of our cities so that you manage both the excess of water, and you live in Chennai, which is at the dead end of every river, which means that your ability to be able to manage your water requires such high levels of sophisticated engineering so that every drop of rainwater is harvested, every drop of rainwater is managed. And that's really the system that you inherited, but we have all destroyed it. We are one generation that will go down in history to say that our pattern of urbanization has actually made sure that we have destroyed our rivers, that we have lost the most precious heritage that we could have ever had, our inheritance of the ponds, the tanks, the rivers that we have destroyed. And today they are nothing more than sewage canals. They are not anymore freshwater systems. But if you go back and you understand the issue of river pollution, we need to move away from that very technocratic view of saying, oh, we can manage our river pollution like they did in the Western world, which is that you will build sewage treatment plants, you will intercept your sewage, take it to a sewage treatment plant, and that one day your rivers will be back like Thames or Hudson or any one of the rivers of the West, which is that they will be flowing once again with fresh water. This view of believing that we can do it like they did it is something that is creating the problem today. The fact of the matter is that they did it at extraordinary cost, and they had the resources to be able to build their cities on the ashes of large numbers of countries in which they generated wealth from. Today, if they were to recreate their underground sewage system, they would not have the financial wherewithals to do so. But we live in this absolutely, this world of thinking that we are on the same staircase and we will take those steps and we will move ahead like they did and reach the point of clean rivers by doing all the steps that they did. But our reality is completely different. Our reality is that vast parts of our cities are not connected today to an underground sewage network. Our reality is that vast parts of our cities are growing so fast that we will never be able to play the game of building those underground sewage networks, which are expensive. And as I said earlier, this is what creates the resource intensity of the use of scarce water, for using it to flush your excreta, for treatment, and for dumping it into your rivers. And it creates the capital intensity, which creates inequity. If you take Delhi, you take Chennai, vast numbers of people in our cities use what can only be called an on-site system. CSC, the organization I work with, does something called shit flow diagrams. It's a diagram in which we basically look at how is excreta in our cities managed. And it gives you a bird's eye view of how the excreta of our cities moves. And if you look at the shit flow diagram of Chennai, if you look at the shit flow diagram of Delhi, these extremely rich cities of our world, you will find that the majority of people actually are not connected to an underground sewage network. They are connected to what can be called A septic tank of the past, today it is nothing more than, in most cases, either a connection to an open drain or it is a connection to a tank. And yet, those systems of the past are something that we never think about because we are lost in this engineering worldview, or a pipe dream, as I call it, that we're going to connect everybody to an underground sewage network. And yet, if you were to rethink again, if I was to think about it, instead of now thinking about connecting everybody to an underground sewage network, knowing that you're fighting a losing battle, knowing that today a small number, minuscule number of people, just as you looked at your issue of air pollution, the issue of water pollution is the issue of a minuscule number of people whose excreta is today being intercepted, conveyed, treated, and that is then mixed with the untreated excreta of vast numbers of people. And that is really the cause of water pollution. If we were to rethink that and say, listen, I come from a country where vast numbers of people are too poor to even afford a sanitation system. So my first job will be to look at an affordable sanitation system, an affordable sewerage system, which can work for the poor and can also work for sustainability of my rivers. If that was the quest in which we would work towards, then you would actually think about that wisdom of the poor, the wisdom of the past, to say, just as much as we know about the wisdom of the past when it comes to rainwater harvesting, of the value of our ponds and tanks, and our ability to capture every drop of rainwater in those to be able to provide drinking water for vast numbers of people in our cities, just as much you would think about, well, why can't I recreate the on-site systems for the future? After all, a country like India has leaped and jumped and forward by moving out of the landline of telephone connectivity to the satellite. So why can't I think of the on-site systems as the future? And that's when we would think about, well, how do I get more resource efficient? The fact is that today's water-based sewerage systems use a little bit, as I said, of human excreta, which is actually good nutrients, and you treat it, and then you put it back into the river. This is, the system has come from countries where they had a lot of water, and they were actually quite wasteful in the use of water. If you think about it from our perspective, you would say, well, how do I take that human excreta, and which is nitrogen and phosphorus, and instead of destroying the nitrogen cycle of the world, how do I reinvest it back on the land? So how do I use that excreta for building fertility of my land, something that was done in the past? Today, we have all the ways in making sure that you can depathogenize it. You can reinvent your system so that you can treat it, you can manage it. But again, the question is not technology. The question is the politics. Is your politics about inclusion? Is your politics based on thinking of that person which Gandhi talked about, that last person? And today, that last person is the last woman. Is that our politics? Because if that was the politics, then you would redesign also your energy systems. Today, the world's wicked problem, the reason for our air pollution in our cities, much of it is also the fact that vast numbers of our people still use dirty biomass for cooking. Women suffer the impacts of that on their health. Now, what is the way ahead in that? Are we investing in building people's livelihood, their ability to be able to pay for that energy, the monetized energy? Or are we thinking not enough of doing that by creating the resilience that we need in our world? So I think in all this, and I can go on and on with the examples, but the fact is, we need that dream and the vision of a truly modern India and a modern city in this case. And that has to be based not on the parochialism of the past and this cultural imperialism of the past that we often get lost in, that we invented the zero and we were the best in everything. And we were. There was a lot of wisdom in our resource efficient societies, but we need to borrow from it, learn from it, and to think about what is there for the vision of a truly affordable, equitable India, which is also a sustainable India. And this really is at the core of the environmental crisis today, because what we as Indians have learned is that we cannot think about sustainability without thinking about affordability. That you cannot think of solutions which work for some and will be sustainable for all. It won't happen. That you have to think about affordability if you want sustainability. And that's really where we are today when it comes to COVID 19. I mean, there have been such enormous lessons that we have learned in this year. And I think this is really where we need to rethink also about the future. We can't forget this year. This year, the year of 2020, may be the most horrific year that we have lived through, but it is a year that we must not forget. And we must not forget it because, in some senses, it has taught us such important lessons. I mean, the most important lesson that we have learned this year has really been how the virus is really magnified the inequities in our world. That when you're looking at today's world, and we talk about, and we come from a society where the white collar society, where we talk about how this remote normal is works well for us, but we come from that society because we can do so because there is a vast number of people in our world where livability is such an important issue, where they can't think about remote working. And we have to keep that in mind. We talk about a digital divide, but we need to talk about a livability divide when we talk about the remote working world as we go ahead. Because I find this, you think about this last year, and you have to think about the exodus of these vast numbers of people from our cities who left our cities because the city turned their back on them. The city basically used their labor. And when it came to a crisis, they didn't have housing, they did not have food. And they had to go back to the Bihar, the UP, the Maharashtra, from all the parts of the villages they came from. And we saw that mass exodus from our own cities. We saw, I think, the most horrific image of last year, as I remember. For me, the image that gave me nightmares was when there were these migrant laborers who lost their lives sleeping. They were so tired, they slept on railway tracks and the train ran over them. These images should really make us think about how do we design our cities so that we can reclaim the public? How do we rethink the need to design for the poorest so that they don't have to leave our cities, so that they can actually work and they have the conditions so that they don't have to leave. And I think this really is really something that the whole world needs to think about, because the globalization model that we've adopted in the world has discounted the cost of environment, it has discounted the cost of labor. When you look at China, the reason why China is what it is not because it is just extraordinarily hardworking. It is because it learned to be the production house of the world without paying the cost of environment or paying the cost of labor, which is why production moved to China and moved out of China as the costs went up to other parts of the world, where again those costs have been discounted. When I work in the field of environment, I know that every time we have clamped down and we have pushed for environmental safeguards on the formal industrial sectors, the production systems have moved to the informal. to the unauthorized industrial sectors where the regulatory arm of government cannot reach, where environmental safeguards do not matter. So, in vast parts of our cities, where the people work, they work where labor is discounted, the cost of labor is discounted, and the cost of environment is discounted. Now, this is really the crisis of environment today. This is the crisis of climate change today. This is the core of it. So I think if we were to rethink of the world of the future, we have to think about the fact that can we actually account for the cost of consumption? Can we raise the cost of production? And if we raise the cost of production, will it mean that we will be able to build a society which will consume less? But then what will be the economic growth model of the world? Because the growth model of the world is built on obsolescence. It is built on creating waste. It is built on creating environmental degradation. So how do you actually rethink production and consumption? And this really gives us the opportunity to rethink about that view of Gandhi in the true sense of the urban and the rural. And this is my last point that I want to make, because, I spoke at the beginning to say Gandhi didn't think of urban, but I was wrong. Gandhi saw urban as part of his larger economic well-being, where urban and rural were infused together, where you actually had a condition in which the well-being of rural India generated the wealth and the conditions for urban India. That there was a symbiotic relationship between the two. It was not a parasital relationship or parasitical relationship as it is today, but a symbiotic relationship. And I think that's the opportunity we have today. I mean, with vast numbers of people going back to rural India, with the issue of climate change staring us in the face, which is making rural Indians much more vulnerable to every next flood, drought, tropical cyclone. The opportunity is to invest in the resilience of rural India. The opportunity is to build wealth and well-being there, is to create conditions so that they don't have to leave. This is the opportunity to rethink Manrega, not in terms of just throwing money in for labor of the poor, but in building ecological assets. This is the opportunity to rethink the agrarian economies of India. I mean, the farmers today in my city are coming in with a tractor rally. But the issue that the farmers are raising is not just an issue of Punjab and Haryana. It is an issue of pan-India. It is an issue which is really talking about the cost of growing food. It is the cost of being able to pay for the investment of farmers' labor into land, into water, into our cost of eating that food, which is nutritious, which builds the well-being and the livelihoods of the poorest. It is not about creating a corporate model of agribusiness, which is really the Western model of growing food, which discounts both nutrition, livelihoods, and discounts sustainability. This then gives us the opportunity of rethinking, therefore, Gandhi in the truest sense of talking about the rural and the urban. Because if you did that, you would create conditions also in urban India where labor would be better paid for, because you would have less people in urban India rushing to our cities because of distress migration. You would create conditions in which you would have to create livability, housing conditions, water supply conditions, sanitation conditions for the poorest, because that would mean that workers would come to work because they would demand dignity in our cities. It would also mean that we would have to invest in sustainability of our cities. That would increase the cost of production. It would make it more expensive to live in our cities. But that may not be so bad. It would be good, because we would create a true, true model, which I think is really the model which Gandhi would have wanted us to create, the dream that he had for a free and fearless, courageous India, um, where we would be able to think of the last person and yet plan ahead with, with the confidence that it requires. So that's really my message for today on Republic Day. I think we have a crisis of sustainability. We have a crisis. We have many crises, but we have huge opportunities. We have massive opportunities to rethink, rework, re-engineer, and dream about a new prosperous India, which creates wealth for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. If I may just very quickly try to summarize a couple of points that you made that really stuck with me. I like the way you talked about flows as being sort of needing to be managed in terms of, or at least addressed in terms of their affordability, accessibility, and environmental accountability. So you talked about transport to begin with, and then you talked about water, other materials, including sewage, drinking water and sewage and so on. And then you very nicely sort of moved from that to our economic system that sort of also that lies at the root of the crisis. And you related that, of course, to our growth models that rely on a kind of a system of obsolescence. And then to think about how we might want to reinvest our fiscal resources, the government's fiscal resources, particularly things like Manrega and so on, to also tackle sustainability through systems of regeneration and so on. And I may be misrepresenting some of what you said, but I also want to tell our audience that it's unfair to ask a person like Sunita to summarize her vast knowledge in a half an hour presentation. And I really urge all of you to subscribe to Down to Earth, their flagship magazine. If you haven't already, don't already have a subscription. I don't know if IIT has a subscription. We'll make sure that we get one in the library, a hard copy. Because for the last 30, 35 years, you've been writing about these very issues in a very practical, cogent manner. And so people who have questions about all of this, they don't expect to get them answered in some glib way. Really, if you're really truly interested, please do some research on this, and CSC is your best resource in India for doing that kind of research. Shall I kind of summarize a few of the questions so that you can answer them?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So those of you who haven't sent your questions on the Q&A, please do so. The chair of the coordinator of this program has been giving you that instruction right from the beginning. So please send, not on the chat box, but in the Q&A. So there's an anonymous attendee who seems to have had a sort of a cluster of questions around the same topic relating to our environmental or ecological footprint. And he or she is asking, how do we decide what that footprint is, and what about your footprint and that of mine in particular? How do we sort of reconcile that with the needs of the planet? So that's a sort of a big set of questions around transport, cars, personal automobiles, and also other, I would imagine, other lifestyle issues. You wanted to say something about our personal individual footprint and why that might be important to keep track of?
I think it's a very good question, and I often struggle with this, because whereas it is important and the data is, I have seen a lot of footprint, and you have also seen footprint data where, one American versus one Indian versus one, one Chinese, and there's enough data to show that what is the footprint that each one of us has, a rich Indian versus a poor Indian. the answer is really, to me, bigger than looking at an individual footprint. The individual footprint gives us the problem, but the solution comes out of two things. One, understanding what drives these footprints. Because at the end of the day, you and I take a car because we do not have a public transport system which is affordable and convenient to large numbers of us. We take we take a car because we don't pay for parking charges. I mean, if you compare just a city of New York versus Washington, it's bizarre if you look at it. New York has vast numbers of people who don't take a car, and that's in the United States itself. And in Washington, 80 to 90% of the people commute still by cars. And it's a lot to do with the availability of just simple parking spaces, the cost of parking, the convenience of having a subway, convenience of having the ability to be able to walk to work. I mean, there are all sorts of issues which create also the conditions in which you can reduce your footprint. So I think it's important for us, as much as we use the footprint as an example, we need to be able to look deep dive and see what is the opportunity to be able to fix that. It's the same thing with food. I mean, you take the footprint of our food. And, and it's a lot to do with, I keep getting asked, about this meat question. And I have to confess that I'm actually, I would argue as an Indian environmentalist that I'm not a vegetarian. I would not advocate vegetarianism. And I know that I'm speaking to a community which is probably going to scream at me, but I would not advocate vegetarianism. And the reason is that the cattle play a very important life in the economy of the very poor farmer. But the problem of meat is how much we eat and how we grow it. So what we need to look at is the footprint of the food we eat in terms of, how much, where is this meat coming from? Is it coming by destroying the rainforests of Brazil and then growing meat as large meat growing places? Or is it coming from the fact that you're actually creating a relationship between the farmer and his cattle, and his ability to be able to use the manure on the land on one hand and monetize the buffalo after the life is over? And I think that's really where we need to be able to rethink a lot of what we talk about from footprints point of view, and rethink and re-talk about these things, because a lot of these things are coming from the West, and we have these very sort of black and white worlds that we need to be able to look at. Where does our world fit in? Sorry, Chella, I've digressed a bit, but I thought I should this aspect.
Yeah. No, you're free to digress. I mean, that's the role of this discussion in any case. There's another sort of cluster of questions around this whole question of urbanization itself. We talk about sustainable cities. Angarika, for instance, says, what about sustainable villages? And others are also asking, how can we sort of improve rural life? So would you want to say something about that and relate that perhaps to Gandhian thought?
Angarika, I think at the end talk about it, because, even though I wanted to talk about the city, I do believe that the village and the city is interconnected. I mean, if you look at today, the crisis of our cities is vast numbers of people moving to cities. And there is no doubt that migration, which we are all part of, is today got hugely speeded up because of the crisis in agrarian and rural economies, where people are not leaving because of the pull of the city, but they're leaving because of the push from the village. And that then is leading to huge crises in our cities, because our cities can't manage the numbers of people who are today seeking both the right to housing, right to water, right to sewerage. All that is just, it's creating the crisis of urbanization that you're seeing. But the way to fix it is to fix the relationship between urban and rural India. I mean, there are only two states of India where, to some extent, there is a different model of urban growth. Kerala and Goa, where the there is a kind, I mean, if you look at all the data, you will see that rural and urban um, places are actually much more uniform in terms of their access to basic goods. And there is a continuity between urban and, and rural, city and village in these states. That's got to be the aspiration across the country, but which means, as I said, you have to rethink also what do you mean by rural investment in rural India. You can't take away the cost of growing food and tell farmers that they are going to get a pitiable MSP, and they don't even get the MSP. I mean, if you look at all the data, it's actually showing that most crops are sold below the MSP. We know that government only procures wheat and rice, and the rest of the crops for which MSP is put out, governments don't procure them, which means farmers, it is the market which procures them. And if you look at the data, it shows very clearly that the farmers do not even get the MSP. Now, if, as for most of you, you would know this, but if you were to go back and say, so how is the MSP calculated? You will see farmers never really get paid the true cost of labor or the cost of the water that they invest in. I mean, the labor of the farmer in building a more secure land water economy is not paid for. And that's also because we have to have cheap food. We are a poor country. The government wants to keep the cost of food low, because if the cost of food goes up, then you get food inflation. So you have to depress the cost somewhere, and you discount that in the cost of the food we grow. And then, of course, the Indian farmer is competing with all the economies of the West, where, call it what you may. And I just put out this data, we put this out in Down to Earth. Look at the latest OECD report on, and this is an OECD report estimating the subsidy to the farming sector. And whereas countries like Norway spend about 60 to 70% of the cost of the production is subsidy, in India it is minus 5%, minus 5%, which means that our farmers are subsidizing us. Now, that in that context, you need to talk about rural well-being. You can't talk about rural well-being by just throwing a little bit of money here and there. You have to seriously look at, again, that what Chela said, the larger question about the economic model that we are going to choose. And that is also a model in terms of the cost of food that we are going to be able to, how are we going to pay the true value of the food we want and the food we must get? And where will that money go? Will it go into the hands of the very poor? So those are the questions that we should be discussing today. And I think that's what the opportunity of, a post-COVID world is, where a lot of things have been reopened. A lot of the things that we took for granted are today up for grabs, as I look at it. There is no absolute truth. There is no one way to move ahead. This is the great opportunity of our generation to be able to relook at things and say, well, we didn't get it right, but we must in the future.
So, Sunita, I think you've partly answered some of the questions relating to, what kind of alternative economic models must we think about, especially in a post-COVID world and so on. But there's one question here around India's key priorities for COP26. And perhaps you can, you're best suited to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, climate change is this, Chela, you and Sujata have done so much work on this that, we all recognize the crisis of climate change being one where we are really looking at both the issue of the model of growth, but we are also looking at how to share growth between nations. And that's really the crisis of climate change, because it's not just about reducing emissions in a particular part of the world. It's about sharing the finite space of the atmospheric space between nations. And that's because carbon dioxide, unlike most other emissions that we have, and methane, these are long-lived gases. So what you did in the past impacts the future. Now, it's in that context that we have to look at what will happen at the next COP. And it's good that Biden Harris have come to power. It's good that the denial of Trump is over, that we are now got climate change back on the agenda. That is good. But what is bad is that the world is not talking seriously enough about both how to cut emissions and how to do it in the cooperative model that is needed. As I see it in COP, in the next COP, some of the big issues that are going to be there are really the issues of both ambition as well as equity. And when you're looking at ambition, the world today, we know that the Paris, the aggregate Paris NDCs, which is the national determined contribution, which are sort of what countries have said they're going to do. The sum of that, the aggregate sum of that does not add up to keeping the world below a 2-degree guardrail. In fact, it means that the world is at least on a 3-degree centigrade rise or even more, which means that we have to up our game when it comes to commitments. But this is where the world is really looking for another cop out. I mean, in climate negotiations, now there is a talk about net zero. So we are no longer talking about absolute reductions. We are talking about reductions, but countries can reduce, and the carbon dioxide they emit can be cleaned up. Now, what does that cleaning up mean? It means planting trees, possibly in the homes of the very poor. It means doing some very smart sort of market mechanisms so that you can pay poor countries for cleaning up your carbon dioxide. So, I mean, those are really back on the table, and we need to address them and start asking some very tough questions, saying, yes, if you want a market mechanism, how will the market lead to transformation, and not just another cheap, convoluted CDM that we had in the past. So I think country like India needs to position itself much more clearly on the side of environment, climate change, integrity, ambition. And we need to make sure that our voice on equity is equally strong, because there is no doubt, and I think this is the real crisis of climate change. If you look at today's emissions in the world, by 2030, the world would have exhausted the carbon budget it has to keep it below a 1.5-degree centigrade rise, which means there is no space for countries like India, no space for continent like Africa to grow. Now, this is completely unacceptable. So, which means that we must make sure that we put equity on the table to demand that the world needs a transformational model, so that we can also move towards what is good for us, good for the world, but that needs to be paid for. So no longer should we just talk about money and technology transfer. We should demand our right to development. That really should be something we put on the table. Now, whether we will or not, Chela, I don't know. We are today wanting to have a high place on the table of polluters, big polluters. We also don't believe in finding a truly transformational answer. So whether we will do so or not, I don't know. But it's your and my job to keep raising the questions and demanding that our government listens to us.
Thank you, Sunita. One final question, especially because you're addressing an audience that's largely made up of engineers and budding engineers. And this is again a consolidation of some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A. You've raised this question of technology as being part of generating the crisis. Perhaps you can sort of say a few words about the role of engineering and technology in sort of resolving the crisis as well.
So forgive me, if I have made you believe that it's technology which is a problem. I think it's politics which is a problem. It's your societal values that are a problem. I mean, if technology is one that believes that it can conquer nature, and if it can bind your rivers, and if you can regrow your food without water, without soil, if your technology prowess and arrogance makes you believe that, you can deal with nature as you will, then COVID-19 should have taught us some things. But that's not technology. That's to do with our maybe, I don't know, I'm not educated, I'm not very literate, Chela. So I don't know if that's how IIT teaches you. So I can't go that far to say that that's the way engineers are taught. But I certainly believe that there is massive role of technology. I mean, when I talk about river pollution and I talk about reinventing the sewage system, it's the role of technology. But it's a technology, it's technology which is driven from a societal view of saying, I want to build a sanitation system in the world which is affordable for large numbers of people and will not destroy my rivers. Now, if you take that as your objective, then you will rethink your sanitation systems in a way that you will say, okay, how do I take this septic tank and take the waste from this septic tank and depathogenize it, find an enzyme which can increase the rate of composition as fast as possible, find a system in which I do not have to use large amount of land to be able to disinfect the pathogens, but actually find a system in which a technological system which can actually deal with the excreta. And I think that's also got to do with how much value we give to excreta versus taking a man to the moon. That's to do with the masculine nature of engineering. I mean, how come all of us remember the scientists who will build a rocket? I mean, I will challenge any one of the engineering students to name one scientist who understood the monsoons. And you won't, because it's not, you don't make it sexy, you don't make it important. And I think that's the value we need to give to this science and to give to the role of societal well-being in our quest for building, for using science and technology and engineering and the knowledge that we have, the incredible knowledge that the young engineers have, and to whom I'm making some sense, that you will use your knowledge to do these things differently. I mean, I do believe that my generation has really made it, we have lost time, huge amount of time. And I think your generation, unfortunately, and I hate saying it because I'm not copping out, I'm not dying tomorrow, I hope. I'm not copping out, I'm not leaving my work. I will continue to do what we do, and I'm sure Chella will, and I'm sure Raghu will, and all of us will. But we are saying to you that you have the opportunity to do things very differently. You don't have, we grew up at a time when a lot of this was seen to be right and good. You are growing up at a time when COVID has brought us to our knees. You're actually I wish I was your age and I could actually grow up in a world in which we would actually have the courage to do things very differently, very, very differently.
Thank you, Sunita. And as usual, we'll end on that brilliant note. And I'm going to ask Karthik now to give the vote of thanks. Thank you again so much for agreeing to join us.
Thank you. Karthik, you're mute.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Sunita, for this wonderful talk and taking all these questions. I think this has been one of the most interactive seminars and webinars, and we've had a lot of questions. And I really wish we had more time to take questions, but it's been wonderful listening to you. And maybe on the last point that you said, I hope we will find the same technology that puts man on moon to also clean up the excreta, right? So there's a lot of these technologies that go hand in hand, right? So you need to have far better processing when you take people on the moon. So a lot of the thriftiness that teaches you, I hope, is going to impact our sustainable development. And thanks a lot for raising all these important points. I hope all these listeners, especially the young ones, will go back and reflect on these because there's a lot to be learned, especially in the COVID scenario and so on. So thank you once again. Thank you for making it. Thank you, Professor Sudhir, for moderating this, and thanks to all the participants. We hope that uh, Siddhi won't stop here. We will continue with more discussions both on the website, and hopefully we'll come up with some internships, projects, and so on a variety of themes that are all related to technology, self-reliance, development, sustainability, and so on. So keep in touch with us, and we hope to see you very shortly. I'm sure we'll have like a really eminent speaker for you on National Science Day as well, and maybe a webinar before that. So we'll see you shortly, and in the meantime, do keep in touch with us. You can catch up with all the previous videos that you may have missed on our YouTube channel. And I'll see you all and wish you a very happy Republic Day once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.